that you really don't gain anything and there's no proof. But other people say that particularly for difficult interventions, for example, an injectable drug, it might be a good thing to really test whether people are interested in really doing this. And I know that I tend to favor it for things that are again more intrusive. For like we're doing a injectable PTH study, and we give people placebo PTH injections for 2 weeks. They take them home, and some of the women come back and say, you know, I really don't want to do this for 6 months. So they drop out, and it's better if they drop out before they're randomized. In terms of increasing adherence, if you can have less frequent or more convenient dosing of a drug, that may increase adherence. For example, if you require that people take the drug in the morning on an empty stomach and wait an hour before they eat, that's very inconvenient, but maybe you could live with it if they took the drug at night before they went to bed. That would be just as good. So really think about the dosing and how they do the intervention. In terms of study visits, you want to not have so many and so long that they're inconvenient, but you want to have enough to maintain contact. So that's kind of a balance that you have in designing the study, to think about that a lot. And a lot of times I think a lot of us as scientists tend to say, oh, I'd really like to measure this and that and the other, and it'd really be interesting and it's scientifically valid, but you get to a point where people begin to see it as a burden and no longer are willing to participate. So that's a balance that you have to do. Some of the studies that we're doing, for example, patients have to come in next door here. There's a big radiology department. There is a series of measurements. There's an MRI, a CT, and then a peripheral CT measurement that we ask people to do. And some of the women don't want to do all of them. So we say, fine, if you don't want to do all of them, you can skip the MRI, for example. So that's something to think about. And then again, study measurements. Painless, interesting, and useful are what you would like yours to be. And you don't want to be obviously painful or boring. And that, in our case, for example, the MRI, which requires them to be in an MRI machine for something like half an hour to 45 minutes, for some people that's very burdensome. So you want to think about either not including those kinds of measurements or allowing people, if they don't want to do them, not to do them. And also, everybody loves to get feedback. We all love feedback. And so if you can give people feedback of their results or of something during the trial or at the end of the trial, that's very important. For example, in studies of osteoporosis, say you're measuring bone density every year, at the very least you could tell people that at the end of the study we'll give you all your results. So give them all their bone density results, maybe give them all their lab results, the study results at the end of the study. Sometimes, for example, you're just doing, say, cholesterol measurements for safety. It's not really your endpoint in the study, and in that case, you can give people results during the study. So the more that you're giving the people, I think the more they're going to be happier with what's going on. What are other things? Educate people. Educate people. People really appreciate information. If you can educate them about the science of the study, why we're doing the study, and their ongoing participation, expectations for participation in the study. There's kind of what I call the warm and fuzzy stuff that's very much appreciated. You know, the staff in the clinic will spend time with the patients. I mean, that's often something that if you can arrange it, it's good. It's obviously difficult sometimes. And try to be sensitive to patient scheduling needs. If you can set up visits that are convenient, say after work or even on weekends sometimes, you know, so that people can come in, they're more likely to come in. You know, I mentioned, for example, easing the logistics of the transportation of the clinic. For example, providing a van or giving reimbursement, say taxi vouchers, which we do very often in trials to just make it easier for people to come. And then also I mentioned like parties or events to create kind of a sense of community. And this is not the van you want to have, probably. You probably want to have a little more comfortable van. But anyway, so those are all just little things that when you're thinking about the study, you know, in addition to the science, I think a lot of this is actually more fun because you're kind of thinking, how can I make this pleasant for the people? And then gifts. I mentioned some of these kind of gifts, but also you can send out cards. A lot of the studies we do, you have the people's birthdays, so the clinic can send out birthday cards. You can send out Christmas cards. I mentioned newsletters, other information. And I think when you're thinking about a study, and thinking about talking to participants, you should also realize that most dropouts occur in the early study periods. Usually, for example, in a 2-year study, most of the people who drop out in the first 3 months. So that's something to pay particularly close attention to. Okay, so then if we go on to talk about adherence to follow-up visits, again, I've talked about this already pretty much. The goal is to have all of your visits, all of them on time within the window. And again, there's some obvious things that you do. Probably if those of you who are clinicians would do this for clinic, that you give appointment reminders prior to the appointment, call the patients the day before, study calendars, and of course to be there to listen to concerns and problems they may have. And again, we've already talked about this. One of the things from a study design point of view is now with ways that we have of collecting data, you often know right away when someone comes in for a visit. So you have instant feedback. So from a study management point of view, you can collect this information and you can have feedback on the websites. And we do this here at our coordinating center. A lot of groups do it. So the people managing the study nurses can get on and they can look at how many of my patients have come in on time, how many of them have been late, and maybe compare my results to the clinic that's in the next state. And so you can really kind of get a lot of information. I think that's helpful to people and helpful to realize where their weaknesses are and how they might correct them. So just to give you an idea of how we did this in the Horizon study, this is the trial of zoledronic acid versus placebo. We were the coordinating center for this. We didn't collect the data, but we were the coordinating center. And that study had an interesting thing because the compliance was great because it was once a year infusion, 15 minutes. So all the people we had to do is get the people into the clinic once a year, give them the infusion, and they had all the drug. But adherence to the visit schedule was therefore really important. And how did we do this? And this is, again, a very typical thing, is they use something called IVRS, Interactive Voice Response System. Well, that's something we all know. It's when you call PG&E and they say press 1, press 2, press 3. So in this study, what happened is when a patient came into the clinic, they had a particular number that the clinic staff would call, and they put in the ID of the patient, and they'd enter just a little bit of information. And that information was collected centrally, and that information was available instantly. And so that allowed us to set up these web reports so that the monitors, in this case, it was an international study, so there were monitors within each country, could look at the data for their sites. And when the monitors went out to the sites, they could pull up the data and talk to the site PI about how your site was doing. So that's a very effective kind of system, and it really can be done in most trials these days. And again, I wanted to emphasize that dropout is a very vague term. And in many, many studies, they say we had so many dropouts. Well, dropout can mean many things. You could have perfect visit adherence, come to all the study visits, but not take a single study medication, or take only 60% of the pills. So you could have perfect visit compliance, but not have good compliance to the study meds. On the other hand, it's possible that you could be perfect about taking your study medications, but miss visits. That's not so common, but it certainly does happen. So these are two really distinct aspects, and I think, again, a good study will distinguish between those in the reporting, and I'll talk about the consort guidelines in a couple of minutes. But one of the things, if you recognize that there are these two different aspects of adherence, the question would be, should you stop follow-up visits for all those who have stopped study medication? And this is very commonly done. One option here is to say, stop follow-up as soon as the drug stops. So a patient, after, say, 3 months of a 1-year trial, says, I don't want to take the study med anymore, and the clinic says, fine, I'm going to close you out, you're done, goodbye. But the second option is to continue the follow-up, even though they're not taking the study medications. And there are advantages to each of the options. And anybody want to suggest what might be an advantage to the first option? If a person wants, yeah. Cost, yeah. So that's one good advantage is if a person stops medication, you don't have to follow them anymore. You save some money. So that's certainly an important factor, something you might want to think about. What about an advantage to the second option?
What the intervention is, maybe even
Right, right.